So I'm going to start by maybe trying to position my book in relation to the occult, because as was stated in that very nice introduction, the book is a sort of road trip memoir, travelogue slash cultural history. So it's not maybe a conventional text about the occult. So what I wanted to do was open this talk by reading from Haunted States. And I wanted to read a passage that I hope will position my work in relation to the supernatural, or at least my understanding of the supernatural. So these are the opening paragraphs of the book, so I'm giving you a little preview there. I grew up in a haunted house, or at least I should have. My childhood home was in a council estate built on top of a graveyard, and for years I heard about how when the builders broke ground in the early 1970s, they discovered a scattered collection of human bones. Some people suggested that perhaps the remains were casualties of a plague or epidemic, maybe cholera, the same disease whose rampage further west in Sligo helped to inspire Bram Stoker's Dracula. Others wondered whether the skeletal remains belonged to victims of the Great Famine that ravaged Ireland in the 1840s. There were no answers, and even now I'm unable to find any record of the excavation. Today, I rent an apartment in an imposing 19th century building that was, until recently, a psychiatric hospital. Every taxi driver and delivery person asks me if it's haunted. Locals tell stories of elderly patients committed by greedy children hoping to get their hands on an early inheritance, of patients who wandered off the grounds and were drowned in the torrents of a nearby weir. Yet nothing strange or spectral has ever disturbed my sleep in either of these allegedly haunted homes. I am interested in ghosts, but ghosts seemingly have little interest in me. I have slept under many supposedly haunted roofs and have never encountered anything more terrifying than the occasional wayward spider lost in a tangle of sheets or darting beneath the dark crevices of a heavy wooden dresser. The absence of ghosts in my life has left me a skeptic, albeit an ambivalent one. I don't believe in ghosts per se, yet my skepticism is soft and pliable. For me, ghosts are unraic beings formed out of the ectoplasmic accretions of horror stories, drawn out from beneath the darkest cinematic shadows and conjured from the deepest crevices of history. The ontological status of ghosts, its reality or lack thereof, means little to me. I am far more interested in what ghosts mean. What they say about the individuals who whisper tales of hauntings, why spirits cleave to certain locations, and why they extend their diaphanous forms through the hallways, attics, and basements of specific structures, and only those structures. I may not believe in ghosts as real, verifiable phenomena, supernatural or otherwise, but I do think specters are endlessly helpful, informative beings. They are the tales we tell when we attempt to articulate the disturbing, unsettling powers exerted by sickly places, and those lands rendered leaden by the weight of history. Yet spirits also tell their own tales. They speak of the fears that gave shape to them and the hopes from which they sprung. I'm interested in the cultural work performed by ghosts, and indeed by other monsters. Why do we continue to summon such creatures into being? Why do we give them such grotesque shapes and imbue them with fundamentally taboo desires? Moreover, why do we sometimes desire them? I'm not a ghost hunter, but nor am I a ghost buster. The book doesn't chart my attempt to prove the existence of ghosts or capture evidence of supernatural manifestations. At the same time, however, it's not an attempt to dispel stories of hauntings, to pull the proverbial mask off of the ghost or the monster and show once and for all that ghosts are tricks, cons dreamed up by the greedy, or illusions conjured from the depths of the human mind. Instead, I'm interested in this book in what ghosts do. I'm interested in the cultural work they perform and what they might say about the diverse societies that create them. So, in the book, I frame ghosts and monsters as expressions of the deepest fears, desires, and hopes of the cultures that birth them. And I argue in this book, and I think it's something that many scholars and academics have argued, I argue that monsters come into being to give form to what might otherwise remain unspoken taboos, prohibitions, anxieties, or lusts that can't be satiated. There's a famous essay that I draw on at the start of this book, and indeed throughout my work, by the literary scholar Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, called Monster Culture: 7 Theses. And in this essay, the author attempts to work out the diverse functions of monsters as they exist across different cultures and time periods. He actually tries to come up with a uniform function for monsters across all cultures. And ultimately, what he determines is that monsters perform roughly the same 7 functions wherever and whenever they manifest. They trouble the categories that we use to understand the world around us. They represent a disturbing sense of the eternal. They stand in for the kinds of sexual, racial, and cultural differences that trouble homogeneous social structures. They show us what is possible while also demonstrating the dangers of pushing too far, breaking through too many boundaries, or, busting too many taboos. Monsters also embody desires that we're sometimes afraid to act upon. And lastly, monsters ask us to reflect on their own motivations for creating them. However, Cohen's most interesting statement about the purpose of the monster is his claim that the monster's body is a cultural body. Basically, monsters are created out of the cultures that they emerge from. They are created out of the fears, the desires, the anxieties of a given culture. So if we make monsters, if we cobble them together from bits and pieces of our own experiences, much like Frankenstein's monster, then the monster is essentially the flesh of our flesh. We make them out of our own fears and our own fantasies. So when we look at the monster, what we see reflected back is ourselves, our cultures, our fantasies, our fears, our desires. The monster is essentially a kind of code, and if we can decipher it, we can see something deep, perhaps even disturbing, about both the individual and the society that created that particular monster. So thinking about some classic examples of the monster as a sort of reflection of its culture, in Bram Stoker's Dracula, for instance, the vampire stands in for a wide array of cultural anxieties. He's the immigrant threatening to destabilize the British Empire. He's a collection of anti-Semitic conventions that speak to fears about invasion and difference. He is also, and this is probably the main one, the embodiment of and I'll put this in air quotes, perverse sexuality and transgressive gender roles in a society that was, at the time, undergoing rapid transformations related to women's rights and both popular and scientific understandings of sex. In a similar manner, half a century later, the metamorphic aliens and bug-eyed monsters that we encounter in 1950s science fiction films manifested fears of communist infiltration and ideological difference. If we skip forward another few decades to the 1970s and 80s and look at, for example, the grotesque body horror that we encounter in the films of David Cronenberg, for example, films like Shivers, Rabid, The Fly, those films have been read as allegories for illness, decay, and perhaps more culturally specific sexually transmitted disease in particular. And I think this is where the true power of the monster, as well as of the ghost, the vampire, and whatever kind of creature you care to conjure up. This is where its real power lies, in its ability to represent those facets of ourselves and of our culture that we struggle to articulate. And these representations are often highly complex, sometimes lacking a direct observable parallel. Monsters can be transgressive, they can be contradictory, they can be multiple, they can exist as unstable, ever-changing conglomerations of everything we fear, of everything we desire, and sometimes both at the same time. So the representational power of the monster, its ability to signify something beyond itself, is at the heart of Haunted States. I'm finally getting to it. The project grew out of my own interest in how the project grew out of my own interest in horror and its capacity to act as a profound commentary on the society that birthed it. And this book, And this book then might be understood as kind of a form of psychogeography, in that it explores how the effects of geographical environment, both built and natural, influence not only emotions and behavior, but also the cultural artifacts that a specific society produces and consumes. So the book is very much an attempt to map diverse forms of monstrosity, to trace some kind of connection between the history and the environment, the topography of certain locales, and the monsters that they engender. And I chose the United States for a number of reasons, and this is something people always ask me, because the book could have been written about anywhere, really. I mean, I could have written it about my own home country, Ireland. We have enough horror in our history to, to generate multiple books. But I chose the US for a number of reasons. I have a background in American literature. I grew up encountering American popular culture, film and television. But one of the main reasons I decided to travel and write about the US was because of some of the unique contradictions that are conjured up by the often uncomfortable encounter between the nation's foundational mythology, the idea of America as the land of the free and the home of the brave, and the violent systems of genocide, slavery, and settler colonialism that both arose out of and facilitated that mythology. And I think this is something that American horror film and literature grapples with in some really, really interesting ways. How does a nation that views itself as a beacon of freedom and democracy reckon with the violence and the bloodshed at its heart? So I'm going to read again from the book, and again this is from the introduction, but I think this sums up some of my motivations for focusing on the US in this particular text. In the early 1960s, a US academic named Leslie A. Fiedler wrote a massive tome called Love and Death in the American Novel. However, the book, which constituted a broad survey of 19th and 20th century American fiction, was not simply an overview of the nation's literary output. Instead, Fiedler was preoccupied with a single question, which he obsessively pursued over some 500 pages. Why is it that a nation ostensibly committed to ideals of freedom, justice, and equality produced a body of literature that is so overwhelmingly bleak? Early in the book, Fiedler maintains that American literature is an essentially Gothic literature, writing that US authors have, time and again, produced a literature of darkness and the grotesque in a land of light and affirmation. When he comes to answer the question of why American literature might be so deeply haunted, Fiedler returns inevitably to the tense relationship between American history and the stories America tells about that history. The terrors that benight American literature, Melville's Monstrous Wail, Poe's Live Burials, Hawthorne's witch-haunted woods, are manifestations of historical horrors that cannot be otherwise articulated. Dark imagery of excessive violence, sadism, and the supernatural becomes the only means Americans have to express the contradictions that plague both their history and their identity. So I'm going to skip ahead slightly, but what I'm saying here is that if the Gothic is anything like the ghosts it portrays, it will not let such histories lie undisturbed. The Gothic, as it manifests in art, literature, and film, is a resurrectionist mode, reviving everything we seek to bury and forcing us to confront its terrifying visage. So the Gothic forces us to confront everything we wish to suppress. It disturbs national mythologies, and it asks us to peer directly at their dark heart. And this can be frightening, it can be disturbing, it can be unsettling, but sometimes this kind of Gothic necromancy, the way the Gothic forces us to look at what's uncomfortable and unpleasant, it can be cathartic, even freeing. And one motivation for this particular trip that I took, this particular research trip, was to discover other uses of horror and the Gothic in American literature and history. Basically, I wondered whether there were times and places where the monsters ceased to be a figure of terror and instead became a symbol of liberation, rebellion, and even subversive pleasure. So the trip that formed the basis for this book took place during the summer of 2022. So I spent about 3 months traveling in the US in 2022. I flew originally to Toronto, Canada, and crossed the border to the US on foot at the Niagara Falls. I did a loop of the country from east to west and then back again before flying home. And during this time, if you're wondering how I managed this, I mostly stayed in very cheap hotels and Airbnbs, though I did try to be ethical about this, staying mostly in rooms that people rented in their own homes to make a bit of extra money rather than properties that were earmarked specifically for short-term rentals. I took 2 domestic flights during that time, but in both cases it was because severe train delays would cause me to miss meetings or connections. However, I traveled primarily by bus, usually the Greyhound, which, if you know anything about American popular culture, the Greyhound is pretty notorious. And I also traveled a lot on the interminably slow Amtrak network as well, which is the national train network in the US. Again, I did this mostly for budget reasons, but also because it allowed me to have a more meaningful engagement with both the American landscape and with its people. And I do talk about this in the book, and I'm not sure if it's an aside, but the experience of taking slow, poorly maintained and unreliable public transport across the US also really crystallized just how profoundly segregated US society is along the lines of race and class, with, for the most part, the nation's most vulnerable citizens struggling to navigate almost non-existent healthcare and welfare provisions, as well as being forced to rely on inadequate public services that were often designed intentionally to ensure that the poor are never allowed to intrude on middle and upper class communities or use their amenities. And in a way, you could argue, and I do argue in the book, that this kind of division traced out along the lines of race and class is also something of a Gothic nightmare. In a nation that presents itself, that mythologizes itself as a beacon of liberty and freedom and equality, the endurance of such profound inequities, it assumes the quality of a dark and buried secret. The portrait in the attic, the beating heart under the floorboards, though only one of those examples is American. So I visited 5 different regions in the US over the course of this particular trip. I visited the Northeast, comprising New York and New England, the Deep South, the desert regions of the Southwest, California on the West Coast, and the Midwestern states that lie in the center of the country and are largely overlooked by foreign visitors. And what I discovered is that each region houses its own unique monsters, and that the forms they take recall both the histories and the topographies, the environmental features of those particular regions. Now, at the same time, and I note this in the book, monsters are not exhibits in a museum or animals in a zoo. They can't be neatly divided into categories or divided up by type and origin. They tend to be hybrid creatures. So the regional categories that I outline in the book, whilst a good and I think effective guide for understanding the Gothic as it manifests in the US tradition, these categories are never steadfast. They're prone to disruption and cross-pollination. However, there are patterns and recurring motifs in the literary and cultural construction of regional Gothicisms that suggest a close bond between monsters and the places that gave birth to them. So New York and New England, so the first chapter of the book focuses on New York and New England, the Northeast. And this is the site of some of the earliest European settlements in North America, not to mention things like witch trials and some of the first violent suppressions of indigenous resistance. And this region is largely characterized by ghosts and hauntings. So if we're looking for a specifically New England, New York kind of monster, it's likely the ghost. Now, these hauntings, though, are always diverse in character. Sites such as Salem, Massachusetts, for example, site of America's largest witch hunt, is haunted not so much by identifiable specters with names and clear identities, but by the ghosts of history. Other places, like the small Hudson Valley town of Sleepy Hollow in New York, are home to more famous ghosts, like Washington Irving's Headless Horseman, a haunting that speaks to the divisions of the Revolutionary War. And then other places, such as some of the tiny towns that form along the Erie Canal, they boast friendlier, more joyful encounters with ghosts. So not all of the ghosts that we encounter in this part of the US are malicious, nor do they necessarily represent a kind of dark or horrifying history. There are some more optimistic, some more positive uses of ghosts in this part of the US. So the western part of New York State, for example, and this was a region that once marked the furthest reaches of European settlement, in the middle decades of the 19th century, gave birth to spiritualism, a new religious movement that sought to bring together scientific rationality and the numinous realm of the supernatural. It sought to bring those two things together. So again, I'm just going to read a couple of lines from the book that I think, hopefully describe this region and its relationship with ghosts. The central and western regions of New York State brim with ghosts. You find them flinging exhibitions from shelves in dusty local museums, overturning furniture in suburban homes, and clattering along hotel corridors in the off-season. Yet despite their seeming ubiquity, not all of these ghosts are frightening and not all are unwelcome. Indeed, many of New York's ghosts are invited guests, long-lost relatives returning after decades of absence, or famous poets and orators, once again thrilling audiences with their words. In dimly lit parlors, these spirits find old friends, bringing comfort to mourners and joyfully describing the peaceful existence that awaits souls after death. So, in this particular part of the American Northeast, particularly the western parts of New York State, you get a very sort of joyful, optimistic view of ghosts and spirits that might seem kind of in contrast to how we typically understand ghosts and hauntings. So in the middle decades of the 19th century, and I feel like, if you're in this bookshop, you're probably aware of this already, but in the middle decades of the 19th century, a group of teenage girls in upstate New York began communicating with spirits. And these teenage girls were the Fox sisters. There were two younger sisters and then one older sister. They began communicating with a ghost that was making kind of weird banging noises in their house. And from these initial encounters, the girls eventually devised a system for communicating with these ghosts, where they would basically snap their fingers they would count, or they would call out letters from the alphabet, and the ghosts would make a banging sound to indicate the letter that they wanted to use. So they developed this rudimentary system of communicating with the ghosts in their home, and from this sprang up the religion of spiritualism, which, went on to become an absolutely huge religious and cultural phenomenon in the US and in Europe in the 19th century. And many of the people you meet in this particular region of New York, as a result, have a very sort of optimistic view of ghosts and hauntings and the spirit world. So, for instance, one place I visited during my trip was a small spiritualist community very close to the Canadian border called Lilydale. And Lilydale was established in the 19th century as initially a kind of summer camp for spiritualists. They would have these camp meetings in the warm weather where they would have like lectures and seances and public performances and all sorts of events. And it eventually kind of crystallized into an entire community. And to this day, it's still an active, functioning town that is largely, almost entirely inhabited by spiritualist mediums. It has quite a small population in the winter, but during the summer it really swells. Lots of tourists come as well. People come for readings and all sorts of things. But there's a very sort of joyful view of ghosts and spirits there. It's very sort of positive, very sort of nurturing. So it's interesting to see these kind of the distinct roles that ghosts play in this particular haunted region. And I think a useful way of thinking about the role of ghosts in this region is through the lens of hauntology. And hauntology is a term, and again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but it's a term that was coined by the philosopher Jacques Derrida, and it essentially seeks to balance ontology, the kind of solidity of being and existence, with the liminal, ambiguous nature of the ghost or the spectre. And the concept was later expanded on by the writer and philosopher Mark Fisher. who used it to describe how we're haunted not only by the past, but by all of the unrealized futures that never materialized. So for Fisher, ghosts are about the past. They're about, something from the past kind of echoing through to the present, but they're also about the future and the promise of the future and the kind of bittersweet sensation that we encounter when we think back on all those promised futures that never actually emerged, never actually solidified. And I think the ghosts of New York State and New England embody that sort of position between past, present, and future. They do often speak to past events. They do often speak to frequently, traumatic elements of the past, wars and, violent acts and witch hunts and things like that. But they do also kind of speak to some of the ways in which individuals were optimistic for the future. And I think the spiritualist perspective on ghosts and spirits that I encountered while traveling in that region really embodies that idea, that notion of the ghost as something optimistic, as, a signifier of something better. And in particular, spiritualism as a movement, and this is something I talked about a lot with people I interviewed for the book. Spiritualism was a movement that, was very much based on kind of scientific ideals and principles, and it was kind of wedded to the kind of positivist notion of science that was dominant in the 19th century. Basically, kind of one of the kind of key ideas informing spiritualism was that, well, we've applied science to the exploration of the natural world around us, and we're starting to, we've applied science to the exploration of space, and we've used microscopes to explore the microscopic realm, and we've been able to use cameras to capture images that the naked eye couldn't ordinarily capture. So why not apply science to the supernatural realm? Why not use science? Why not use a scientific method to explore the spiritual realm? So spiritualism was very much kind of grounded in the scientific idea of the spiritual, this idea that a seance was almost like a scientific experiment. If you replicated the same conditions over and over again, you would get the same result. And there were specific instruments developed for seances. It was a very much a kind of scientific view, and even today it's still described as as it is in Lilydale, the science and religion of spiritualism, as opposed to simply a religion. So it's kind of a fusion of the two. So a few other places, and I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on this because I know I've already been talking for a long time, but a few other places that I visited in this trip also kind of, confronted me with diverse forms of monstrosity that reflect those specific locales. So in the Deep South, for example, so after New York and New England, I traveled down to the Deep South, to Florida, to Louisiana, in particular, also to Virginia, which is a little bit further north. But one of the things that was fascinating about that particular region is that in contrast to the kind of diaphanous, intangible spirits that haunt the popular imagination in the Northeast, the South is instead characterized by an obsession with the living dead. So things like zombies, vampires, live burials, all of these are characteristic of the Southern Gothic imagination. So in cities like Richmond, Virginia, which was for a long time the home of Edgar Allan Poe, and New Orleans, Louisiana, the primary expressions of monstrosity, they're not these intangible, diaphanous ghosts, but rather sort of weighty, corporeal, tactile bodies that have been interred in the earth, only to return in often gruesome ways to the land of the living. And there are multiple reasons why I think the South, based on my research, the South focuses on sort of these grotesque, undead bodies more so than ghosts or specters. Part of it is, I think, the legacy of slavery in the American South, and slavery itself has often been kind of characterized as a kind of living death in which a person no longer has control over their body, their agency is stripped away. There's also, of course, the influence of voodoo, particularly in areas like Louisiana, and that is, of course, a syncretic religious system that fuses West African spiritual beliefs with Louisiana or French Catholicism, and that's likely another source informing the interest in sort of the undead or the living dead as a particular mode of monstrosity. However, one thing that I argue in the book is that one of the reasons that the undead, vampires, resurrected bodies, live burials, one of the reasons these are such a recurring motif in the Southern Gothic imagination, in Southern horror fiction and film, is because of the region's unique climate and its topography. So much of the South has a subtropical climate and it's dominated by swamplands. So again, I'm going to read a little bit from the book just to give you a sense of how I'm describing that or how I'm thinking about that in the book. So the southeastern United States is characterized by a subtropical climate. In the summer, thunderstorms sweep in from the Atlantic Ocean or swirl up in warm currents from the Gulf of Mexico. Rich mud caked thickly along the banks of the Mississippi, and primeval swamps generate noisy, buzzing life in abundance. Things grow quickly, lavishly sprouting tendrils, buds, petals, vines. The gauzy purple flowers of wisteria plants hang placid as bluebells, while their thick vines wrap around tree trunks in twisted, choking knots, or crash through the foundations of houses, pulling up boards, cracking walls. Spanish moss clings to the branches of oak and cypress trees, drifting in the breeze like ragged burial shrouds. Much of the southern United States is colored by the inescapable presence of swamps and wetlands, the dark, viperous underside of the genteel antebellum South. The swamp was a tenebrous reflection of the region's concealed horrors. Anthony Wilson, who's another critic whose work I draw on in this book, observes that during the pre-Civil War period, when the southeastern states grew rich on the trade in cotton, tobacco, rice, and human bodies, the region's planters saw themselves as a civilizing force engaged in a perpetual struggle against the raw, animalistic swamp. Expelling noxious fumes, foul stenches, and clouds of mosquitoes, it was viewed as a breeding ground for diseases such as yellow fever and cholera, afflictions that at the time were understood to arise from bad air. The swamp sheltered life that was thought to be treacherous. It was primordial chaos, a liminal space that disrupted the neat topographical division between land and sea. And in the case of the swamp, death here really is a kind of undeath. If the miasma of the swamp is thought to bring death, the deep, fathomless waters and rich, syrupy soil promise vibrant, albeit cryptic life. Things buried here might refuse death, stumbling back to the world of the living like zombies. Decayed matter may engender new life, but that growth might be wrong, twisted, corrupt, like the Spanish moss that interlaces the gnarled fingers of old-growth oaks. So essentially what I'm arguing in that particular section is that in addition to its often grotesque history associated in particular with the slave trade, the emphasis on the living dead, on vampires, on kind of zombie-like figures that we get in the Southern Gothic imagination in particular is related to the topography of the landscape and in particular the swamp. And we really see this in kind of folklore, but also literature and films centered in and around New Orleans. Because in that part of the world, nothing stays buried for long. If you've been to New Orleans or if you've seen, images of New Orleans, one thing you might be aware of is that that city is known for its absolutely massive cemeteries. They're like cities of the dead, and they're comprised of these vault-like above-ground tombs. And the reason that people were buried above ground, typically in New Orleans, as well as other parts of Louisiana and along the banks of the Mississippi, is that if a body was buried in the ground, the waters of the Mississippi, when they rose, when they swelled during periods of heavy rain, they would flood the cemeteries and burial grounds, forcing corpses back up to the surface. Similarly, the unbearable southern heat, combined with the gases produced by decomposing bodies, I know this is getting very gross, were known to blow the slabs off the tops of graves. So in this context, death was omnipresent for people living in those areas. Bodies that were buried in the earth didn't stay buried. And I think this is something that kind of transfers over into the folklore of the region, which is rich in stories of vampires and the returned dead, but also into fiction and film. If you think of cultural representations of the vampire in American popular culture, they are pretty much always set in the American South or in some way related to the American South. So whether it's something like Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles or Charlene Harris's True Blood books, or even, unfortunately, Twilight, where one of the characters was a former Confederate general, there's a connection in the American context between vampires and the South. And while I think much of this is connected to the nation's to the region's history, I do also believe that it has a kind of a particular grounding in the unique landscape of that part of the US. So I'm not going to go into detail about some of the other regions I visited. I spent a lot of time in the desert regions of the Southwest, and in relation to that, I write in particular about kind of science fiction horror films and their use of kind of gargantuan insects, giant lizards, and things like that as a way of reflecting not only the uncanny vitality of the desert. You know, we tend to look at the desert and assume that it's dead, that there's nothing there, but there's actually a wealth of life kind of buzzing beneath the surface. And I think that those kind of 50 science fiction films that present us with, you know, giant ants and lizards and spiders and things like that, it's interested in the kind of hidden, uncanny quality of life in the desert, but it's also a testament to anxiety surrounding the sustained nuclear testing that went on in desert regions of the US during the middle part of the 20th century, particularly New Mexico and Nevada. In California, I look at sort of the dark side of the American dream, the dark side of the Hollywood dream in particular. So I look at texts that feature kind of, you know, maddened, washed up movie stars, you know, things like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane or Sunset Boulevard. But I also look at kind of the representation of cults in American culture, related primarily to California. There was this notion in kind of towards the latter part of the 19th century and then onwards into the 20th century that California, because it was at the western edge of the frontier, it was essentially unchurched, so it lacked a kind of historical religious identity, and therefore it was kind of fertile space for new religions to establish themselves. And so the notion of the cult, and particularly the cult leader as a kind of monstrous incarnation of the American celebrity, is an idea that that really proliferates in that part of the US. And when I was there, I was able to spend some time visiting some of the Hollywood graveyards and looking at kind of the darker side of celebrity culture there. But I was also able to interview some Satanists in San Francisco. They were really nice, actually. In case you were wondering, they were lovely people. But because again, that Satanism is a religious movement, a new religious movement that really, there's a lot of debate about where it began, but in its kind of modern incarnation, it really owes its origins to California in the 1960s and that kind of cultural ferment of that particular period. So to sort of connect all of as I've said, all of these different regions, their unique history, their landscape, to the kind of monsters that they produce, the kind of monsters that we see in literature and culture. And while these categories aren't exactly fixed, for example, in the Northeast United States, in New England in the 19th century, there was quite a well-known vampire panic in which the family members of people who had died of tuberculosis basically began exhuming dead bodies and burning their organs because they were afraid that they were returning as vampires and feeding upon the living. So the categories, of course, don't, hold in a strict sense. There's always going to be some overlap, some cross-pollination, but I do think that it's possible to sort of map monstrosity in a way that shows how particular histories, cultures, landscapes, traditions, environmental conditions birth specific monsters. So I think I'll finish there because I feel like I've been going on for a long time. If anyone has any questions or thoughts or anything.
So do you believe in the paranormal activity? I mean, you haven't seen them yourself, but do you still believe that they really exist?
I'm ambivalent, to be honest, about ghosts. I'm ambivalent about the supernatural in general. I wouldn't describe myself as a believer, but I also don't discount the possibility that the supernatural exists, which sounds like a really sort of like wishy-washy answer. It sounds like an easy way out. But at the same time, what I'm more interested in, more so than like the reality of ghosts, more so than the reality of vampires or spirits or, any other kind of supernatural entity, is what they say about a particular culture and why people create them and why they give life to these creatures and what they mean for the people who tell stories about them. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
I'm so quiet. Yeah.
That was a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, so informative.
Thank you.
Do you go into any of the extraterrestrial, visitations?
I didn't get a chance. That was something I thought about looking at, actually. I did think about, while I was in New Mexico, going to somewhere like Roswell and incorporating that as well, because that obviously fits into that kind of post-World War II, Cold War era anxiety about invasion and conquest and things like that, as well as that kind of mistrust of the government and this mistrust of the structures that are supposed to support you as a nation, as an individual. But I just didn't have time, unfortunately. I actually have a lot in the book, and it's quite a big book, but I actually had a lot that I ended up having to cut out just for space, because when I submitted the first draft, they told me it was much too long. So I think if I'd included that, it would be even longer.
That's
but I think it's interesting. Volume 2, exactly, yeah.
But isn't there a long kind of tradition of, believing in ghost experiences with ghosts in Ireland as well?
There is. I mean, again, I definitely could do a follow-up to this in Europe. I could travel around Europe and do a similar version. But there is a long tradition of belief in spirits, of kind of related figures like the banshee, who's the figure who's supposed to, whose cry is supposed to signify the death of a loved one. We do have a very kind of long tradition, obviously Samhain, Halloween, it's, the time of year for it, the time of year when that veil between the world of the living and the dead is supposed to become porous, the dead can return to visit. And I mean, that's not just something that you get in Ireland, that's where Mexican Day of the Dead comes from as well. It's the belief that on this particular day, coming up to All Souls, the dead are able to return to life, or to Earth, and visit their loved ones. And that's why they have, for Mexican Day of the Dead, those beautiful altars where they leave out flowers and photographs, but also like treats like cakes and sweets and cigars and bottles of rum or tequila or whatever. So I think it's a pervasive belief, I think, across the world. But yeah, it's definitely something we have in Ireland as well. And of course, with, extensive Irish migration to the US as well, I'm sure that some specifically Irish aspects of that belief made their way to the US. Yeah, and I mean, a lot of the most interesting beliefs, a lot of the most interesting kind of supernatural elements that you see in the US, or stories of the supernatural, do have their origins in other cultures. So like a lot of the stories of vampires in New Orleans actually originate with the French, with the original French settlers. So there's a story about these young girls called the Coffin Girls. And they were basically a group of young women who were brought over from France to marry the rough and ready Frenchmen who'd already settled in Louisiana. I guess, they were thinking these men need wives, it'll make them settle down and behave themselves. So basically, a literal boatload of these young French girls were sent over to marry the French settlers, and they stayed in the Ursuline convent in New Orleans. But the story goes, and there are kind of multiple versions, but the story goes that when the nuns went upstairs to look in the attic where the girls were storing their belongings, they found that their trunks that they brought with them were empty, and the implication was that actually the girls were vampires and had been sleeping in their trunks, and that was how they made their way over to the New World. So a lot of those have those vampire stories have their origins in kind of the French settlement. A lot of the most interesting stories in the American South have African American origins that can be traced all the way back to West Africa. A lot of the stories, they come through migration in other parts of the world. And you can see echoes of them in stories from various parts of the world. But no, that's a great question. Thank you. Yeah.
I thought the thing about technology was really interesting.
Yeah.
Spiritualism, and I wonder if there's any that leads on to any kind of parallels with something like in Britain, M.R. James.
Yes.
And the sort of antiquarian thing and the understanding of geologic sort of time and deep time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whether anything like, because it's been a while since I've read any Poe, but any any of that kind of stuff?
That is a
comes into it?
fantastic question. Absolutely. And I mean, Poe was interested in science and in the scientific world. So he did write, he's often credited as being one of the kind of pioneers of science fiction. And he did write texts that sought to kind of describe the nature of the universe and the kind of the world beyond ours. So I do think that there's a parallel there, and I do think that a lot of the kind of the horror fiction and the supernatural fiction that we see emerging in the 19th century, while we might be kind of tempted to create a sort of rigid division between science and the supernatural and suggest that like the supernatural, and particularly the supernatural in fiction, that it was a reaction against the scientific world, that it was a reaction against, Darwinism and new technology and, shifting ways, evolving ways of thinking about the world. They're actually, in many ways, very closely connected. So you have things like, for example, the Society for Psychical Research emerging in the 19th century, which was very much engaged with or very interested in applying, again, scientific techniques, scientific principles of, empirical investigation to the supernatural. And that's what you see with spiritualism as well. It's this idea that actually we can use new technologies, we can use science and technology to explore the spiritual world. And spiritualism was referred to at one point in the 19th century as, I think it was God's telegraph. So there was a connection, this kind of rhetorical connection between the telegraph wires that were being kind of, that were being installed across the United States and opening up new systems of communication, and the system of communicating with the dead. So there was an idea that like, well, we have this new technology that lets us communicate with people on the other side of the country, that's amazing. What if we were able to similarly devise a method of communicating with the dead? And of course, the 19th century is also when you see things like, spirit photography developing. And again, that's, while you had a lot of people who were, fraudsters and, there were a lot of hoaxes, the whole idea behind spirit photography was that you can use a camera and you can use a photographic image to capture something that might not be visible to the naked eye. So I think what's fascinating about that particular moment in time is the idea that rather than being, at odds with each other, there's actually a lot of overlap between the scientific and the supernatural. Generally.
And there's something also about after the wars and people wanting to make contact with people, with partners.
Of course, yeah.
Family who died.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you see kind of an uptick in spiritualism and a kind of a growth of interest in spiritualism after kind of periods of war and conflict. So like in the US, spiritualism like becomes a thing in the 1840s. That's when it first emerges, and it becomes increasingly popular. But it's something that people really sort of grab onto after the Civil War, after that kind of, just that massive scale of death and destruction. So you start seeing people really become invested in spiritualism at that time as a way of like hoping to communicate with lost loved ones. And then you see a similar thing absolutely after the First World War as well. It's almost a reaction to that kind of, that just huge, unimaginable level of loss, a desire to kind of interact with or, communicate with someone who's been lost. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you.